Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. For the final show of 2020, it's welcome back to one of the most popular guests from this year, Professor Tim Bale, expert on political party membership, opposition parties, and much else besides. Welcome back, Tim.
Hi, Mark.
Now, back in May, which feels a long time ago now, we talked about 5 lessons you have for what an opposition party needs to do. So I thought it'd be quite a nice way of giving a little bit of perspective to this year, but also look forward to what politics may hold in 2021, to think about each of those lessons in turn and what we think about both Labour and the Liberal Democrats on those. The first one was, you said that basically to be successful, an opposition party needs to have fresh faces, signifying a generational change. I guess on the Labour front, that's, pretty much job done, isn't it? Keir Starmer is not Jeremy Corbyn, and the public have noticed that he's not Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not sure there's a lot more to say from the Labour perspective on that one.
Well, obviously, Keir Starmer himself represents a fresh face. I'm not quite sure he represents such a big generational change. I think his age is kind of indeterminate in a way, although, of course, he does look younger than Jeremy Corbyn, but then the vast majority
That's
of
true. It'd be fascinating, pointless, but also fascinating to poll the public on what age they think Keir Starmer is. But I suspect, as you say, because Jeremy Corbyn looked like an older person, and Keir Starmer looks the slightly indeterminate middle-aged, if anything, I would expect people might overestimate the gap in their ages.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I think the other thing you'd have to say about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party is the shadow cabinet. And in some ways, his task has been made a little bit easier by the fact that some of those people who, you might have expected him to keep in, he hasn't had to because they've made mistakes themselves. So although he hasn't undertaken this massive purge of left-wingers, it is a noticeably different shadow cabinet from the one that Jeremy Corbyn would have appointed. So he's got an advantage there. The disadvantage, of course, is that along with fresh faces goes lack of recognition. And there's been some polling out quite recently, for example, about Annalisa Dodds, who is proving, I think, a fairly capable shadow chancellor, but she's not someone who many members of the public actually recognise. She hasn't, as it were, appeared on their radar yet. And that might be, of course, because we're some way out from an election. But on the other hand, it's quite difficult for her because she is facing someone who, at the moment anyway, is one of the most popular members of the government in Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, although I guess if the job is to be obviously different from the past, in a weird way, being relatively low profile is actually fine. If the public's view is, well, we don't know who this new Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer is, just built into that very comment is something has changed from the past.
Yes.
And I'm sure, all politicians of all parties would like to be well known by the public. At least most politicians of all parties would like to be well known by the public. But it feels like it's one of those things that, political news programs can get terribly excited about, the vox pops where you show members of the public photos of politicians and nobody can recognize them. The relationship between that and actually winning or losing an election, though, seems pretty weak. You can have a very obscure cabinet or shadow cabinet team and still do perfectly well. So I suspect it's the change thing that really matters rather than how well known the new faces are.
Yeah, I think you've got a point. And of course, we'd also have to say that, to be honest, it's the leader who really embodies and incarnates the party as far as most voters are concerned. In as much as they're paying attention to whoever's there, it is the leader first and foremost. So the team he appoints, as you say, can give an impression of change, but it doesn't have to be too precise, and it doesn't have to come down to named individuals. I think that's quite right.
And also, I think that's where the EHCR's report into anti-Semitism is so, in its own right, it's a really important thing, and absolutely right that the Labour Party tackles it. And, speaking from the outside, really welcome that the Labour Party has a leader who wants to tackle those problems. I guess that just from a purely political perspective makes life for Keir Starmer easier as well, because it gives him a very obvious, clear issue to distinguish himself from his predecessors, because the HRCR's report has the force of law behind it. it actually makes some of the internal battles easier, because in the end, the Labour Party has to change. Otherwise, they get, have the law thrown at them. And it's also an issue on which, the public is overwhelmingly opposed to anti-Semitism. So it's also an issue where he's on the public side.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that hasn't been noticed actually recently is the HRC have actually accepted Labour's proposals for implementing their suggestions, which is a very positive thing for the Labour Party. And of course, one could also say from the point of view of the left that this really is not the issue that they want to fight on, but it is the issue that many of them seem to have chosen to fight on over the last few weeks.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a moment, because that comes on to the second lesson for what oppositions need to do. But before we do, we should give a nod to my own party, the Liberal Democrats. And I guess for us, this question of fresh faces, generational change, is a little bit trickier because Ed Davey, our new leader, was a minister in coalition, and the party, ever since 2015, and indeed even during the 2015 election, has been torn between thinking we should defend the record of coalition and we should half apologise and maybe talk up some good points, but also concede that things went wrong and try to move on. And the old mantra of people like Alistair Campbell was very much you've just got to move on in such situations. Well, I think a lot of Lib Dems have been more attached to the idea of defending a lot of what happened in coalition, especially things like legalisation of same-sex marriage. So if you were giving Ed Davey advice on how to apply that fresh faces lesson, what would you say the sort of party's take should be on, should we basically just try to move on from coalition, not talk about it, try and I guess apologise and move on quickly where it comes up, or should we still be trying to defend what happened?
I mean, I think from the point of view of most voters, it is such a long time ago now. The decision to go in is 10 years ago, and the leaving of the coalition was 5 years ago. I really think that it's something that Lib Dems perhaps agonise more over than they need to. I mean, clearly there will be attacks, particularly from the Labour Party, about the Lib Dems record in coalition. But I think as we move towards 2024 and possibly, of course, even earlier, given the changes to legislation on the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, I just can't see most voters, even the sort of target voters for the Lib Dems, worrying too much about it. I think the answer to it is, well, that was then, this is now. We made some mistakes, we did some good things. It's always a kind of balance. When you go into government, you can't please everybody. We're proud of some of the things we did, and perhaps we regret some of the things that we did as well. But we're facing the future. I think that's the way I'd play it.
Yeah, I think when there are, say, Labour attacks over austerity, I mean, I still have a strong instinct to want to respond with pointing out how, say, Alistair Darling was promising bigger cuts than Margaret Thatcher in public spending ahead of the 2010 election. But that does feel like quite an antiquated point to be making. And I guess the key, I mean, Joe Swinson tried the sort of, apologise, acknowledge successes, move on approach, and it didn't really work in 2019 in the general election. But I think it's the sort of approach which, it's not the approach in itself that succeeds or fails. It's if you were popular, saying, well, it's a mixed record, let's move on, people will go with. If you're not popular, people won't respond well to that point. And therefore, in a sense, I think the challenge is not so much for Ed and his colleagues to fine-tune that particular message, but it's rather to find ways to be more in the public eye and more popular, because then there will be the leeway.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there. I mean, I think people will, in some ways, take the same message from a different messenger and respond to it differently. Quite right.
Okay, number 2, unity and discipline was your second lesson. And on reflection, I'm slightly surprised, actually, that this was one of the lessons that you put in for successful opposition parties, because I guess a little bit of a cliche often is to say that an opposition party leader needs to find, a clause 4 moment, some high profile, symbolic, controversial moment about demonstrating they're a fresh face and they're moving on from the past. But nonetheless, your reading of the evidence over the years, over the decades, maybe over the centuries, not quite sure how far back some of your research goes, is that unity and discipline is really important. And I guess in that sense, it's probably a slightly mixed picture for Labour this year.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important that clearly the new leader and the new leadership more generally is seen to be in control of the party. Now, that, of course, slightly depends on if they are to have a row, when that row occurs. So if it occurs early on in the lifetime of the parliament and it allows the leader and those around him to establish control, then that's no bad thing. I mean, I would caution against, and I think Keir Starmer anyway is of this mind, that there's no point confecting a row, trying to actually have one in order to establish one's credentials as a leader. But in some ways, he's been forced into having one by the way that Jeremy Corbyn reacted to the HRC report. And you'd have to say, actually, that although he's had problems with grassroots members, and, you know, there have been a few MPs who tried to kind of lead that, you know, grassroots revolt against Jeremy Corbyn's suspension, actually, I don't think there is very much enthusiasm in the PLP and indeed large sections of the membership to, you know, defend Jeremy. There hasn't been perhaps as much fallout over the last few weeks as I thought there was going to be at one stage. So, I mean, I think, you know, there is always an opportunity in an argument as long as the leader can win it. And I think by and large, Keir Starmer is winning that argument, although, you know, it will rumble on for a little bit longer because people are so attached at the grassroots, at least some people, to Jeremy Corbyn and the memory of Jeremy Corbyn. He has still got a problem there. I mean, you know, it might not be possible to keep Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party, or the PLP anyway, I should say, forever. He may well have to be, as it were, welcomed back in, but it will depend on Jeremy Corbyn, I think, apologising for what he's done.
And it strikes me, in, I guess, as long as Starmer doesn't end up losing a particular procedural battle, in a way, all of those arguments sort of help, because as one of his key messages is that he's not Jeremy Corbyn, having to fight some internal battles that remind people of Corbyn is not unhelpful. I think if he was having to fight battles that reminded the public about, say, a policy failure of a previous Labour government, I can see how that could be damaging. But it strikes me, on balance, what's happening is likely to just continue to aid Keir Starmer. I think on the Lib Dem side, I guess the brutal reality is that most of the public don't pay enough attention to the Lib Dems for there to be any, for there to be the level of attention to what's going on for people to spot how united or not we are. Yeah. But I think at the sort of the basic functional level, you know, things like the sometimes classic tensions between rival party leadership candidates and so on, all of that seems to be going pretty well. That, you know, Ed Davey and Layla Moran get on very well. I would say probably they have a better working relationship than, say, Nick Clegg and Chris Huhne did in the aftermath of the Clegg-Huhne leadership contest. And so, you know, in as much as there is anything that the public notice about the degree of unity in the Lib Dems, it seems this is one that things are ticking along pretty well on.
Yeah, and I mean, that actually makes me think of the effect of the pandemic on all this, because, of course, what we haven't had is, you know, party conferences and bust-ups there. I'm not saying...
Excuse me, Liberal Democrat, online conference.
Yeah.
Other parties have not been able to be as organised as us, I think you'll find.
That's true. But I mean, we haven't had footage of people having stand-up rows at conference. And I think that, to some extent, has helped the leaderships of all the parties, actually. You know, that there might have been more problems. And certainly one can imagine, given some of the arguments over the strategy pursued by the Lib Dems, you know, at the election, more of a row having occurred about that, but it hasn't actually. I mean, I think the publication of that actually very kind of honest report by the Lib Dems helps in that respect. I think, you know, there may be a few policy disagreements there. There always are with the Lib Dems, but as you say, at the moment, I don't think, you know, the public is paying enough attention to those. I mean, I guess also that's true for Labour. I mean, there will be inevitably some friction if and when Keir Starmer begins to move away from, you know, the Corbyn agenda.
Yeah, and certainly, I think, had there been physical autumn conferences, you know, just the ability of journalists to pick up gossip in the bar, etc., just that basic flow of information that can be turned into splits, etc. stories, I think is missing. It reminds me, thinking about this, never actually mentioned it to him, but I'm always quite impressed by where Stephen Bush of the New Statesman situates himself in the bar at Liberal Democrat conference. It's as if he studied years of the flow of people through the physical space of a conference bar to work out where is the best place to be located. But certainly every time I've seen him there, he seems to be in the perfect location. So I don't know if that's instinct or careful design. I should ask him next time I see him in a conference bar. But I mean, certainly at our autumn conference, there was obviously quite a high profile sort of keynote debate, as it were, on the party's European policies, and certainly very passionately held views on both sides. I think in the end, the vote was, a very, very clear one for the policy that we went for. And also, I think it's the sorts of differences that were expressed in that debate over basically at what point should we be campaigning for Britain to rejoin the EU are the sorts of differences that will fade rather than get greater over time. Because in the sense, everyone agrees on where we should be in the long term. The disagreement is over where, the short-term tactics and so on. And so as time goes by, you get closer and closer to the long term anyway. So I think, fingers crossed, the Lib Dem ship will be a relatively happy one.
Yeah, that's interesting. Parliament. I mean, it's, of course, the European dimension is more problematic in some ways for Labour, and their decision on what to do about a deal or no deal, etc., may well reverberate for a few years, because of course if Brexit is seen to be a disaster, as it could be by more people over time, then Labour either backing or not backing a deal, or its stance on no deal may be dug up by people and used as a stick to beat Keir Starmer either way.
Yeah, and I think Labour has probably the harder task at the next general election than the Lib Dems in one key respect, which is, although there's an awful lot of, it's almost metropolitan sneering about how the Red Wall seats are completely different from, southern England, and people in the Red Wall seats are meant to not care about the environment or, sort of social rights issues and so on. Nonetheless, I think it is true. I think it is objectively true that there is a much bigger demographic and attitudinal variation between the sorts of seats Labour needs to win to do really well at the next general election and the sorts of seats the Lib Dems, we need to win to do well at the next general election. That for the Lib Dems, we've got a more homogenous target of who we need to aim for. Labour is quite torn between different groups of people and quite a lot of internal disagreements between those groups of people, which, if you're doing really well, becomes a huge strength because of the breadth of your appeal. But if you're struggling, I suspect there could be quite a lot of internal debates in Labour to come over, which bit of the country are they supposedly neglecting to appeal to and they're going to fail to win seats?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, especially about the Lib Dems. I mean, the research that we did, as points very clearly to the fact that actually the Lib Dems and Labour aren't really in competition with each other in many places at all, and the seats that the Lib Dems need to aim for are basically Tory Remainer seats for the most part, and that does give the Lib Dems a very focused target at which to aim, but as you say, for Labour, their electoral coalition is perforce far more heterogeneous. But I do also think you do make a very good point there that if the party is riding high anyway, it will be possible to put these things together. It always is. After all, Tony Blair's great genius was to sort of knit together a middle class and a working class and a southern and a northern electoral coalition, and that's much easier to do, obviously, when you're more generally popular and the government is seen to be in trouble.
Yeah, and I'll include a link in the show notes to that report that you mentioned, Tim, because it's an excellent report and is really striking, for example, in terms of how few seats there are which are Labour Lib Dem contests at the moment, how much it is Labour versus Tories and Labour versus SNP, and how much it is Lib Dems versus Tories and Lib Dems versus SNP.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, of course, that although that is true in parliamentary constituencies, it's not always so true at a hyper sort of hyper-local level.
But, Liberal Democrats in Sheffield and Manchester are probably poised to email and tweet at us to point that out.
Yeah.
As indeed may any Labour listeners from either of those cities.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because of course you want your activists at a local level who are going for council seats, and of course we have got these kind of mega local elections due to take place in 2021.
I noticed how you said due to take place.
Yeah, I was going to say touch wood, but you know, so there will be some fierce competition.
You see what 2022 ends up being. Oh, crikey! 3 years worth of elections on one day. That would be all
your Christmases come at once, Mark.
Oh dear. Okay, so we've talked about unity and discipline. Visibility was the third key factor, which is one I think it's fair to say the Liberal Democrats, you know, this is probably our biggest challenge, partly because with 11 MPs is the basic currency of media attention. It's hard to get national media interest and coverage, and that's where things like our grassroots campaigning is so important, and where this year has been really difficult because, of course, with coronavirus lockdown, that has hugely held back, rightly so, obviously for health reasons, but it's hugely held back that sort of local activity. I think for Labour, it's been much more straightforward, hasn't it? Because when you have big national issues like coronavirus, the media very naturally turns to the leader of the opposition. So Keir Starmer has been able to get quite a lot of media coverage, and Labour quite a lot of profile, without necessarily having to say or do that much, although he has chosen his moment quite well on a couple of occasions, hasn't he?
Yes, I mean, I think he has been playing a very cautious game. I mean, keeping, as it were, just ahead of the government, but not too far ahead. I mean, he was very concerned not to be, accused of cancelling Christmas, although he did make an intervention there. He made an intervention a few weeks earlier on suggesting a kind of circuit breaker lockdown. So it's quite difficult, I think, for the Conservatives now to accuse him of being Captain Hindsight, which was one of the favourite slurs thrown at him by Boris Johnson. That's not going to be so easy to do. And I think you're right. He's almost kind of got a guaranteed place as the leader of the opposition when it comes to the kind of media's commitment to balance on any kind of political aspect to the coronavirus crisis. And that has been an advantage there. I mean, presumably that means that some of the other people in the leadership, those in the shadow cabinet, will be beavering away on their particular portfolios, getting into them, so that when eventually, touch wood, we do get out of this crisis, they'll be ready to go with some, more eye-catching kind of initiatives and policies.
Yeah, I guess the person who's most surprised me with their pretty low media profile this year, therefore, has been Jess Phillips, that with her brief around domestic violence, I mean, sadly, with coronavirus, that's been an even more important issue. And she certainly had a reputation as being very much a media attention grabbing MP, but she doesn't seem to manage to turn that into being the sort of front bench spokesperson who grabs a lot of attention.
No, I mean, that's true. She has had a slightly lower profile than perhaps one would have imagined. That might not be so true as we go into the new year, of course. And of course, she, like everybody else, is actually coping, with the sort of domestic side of the coronavirus crisis as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Is politicians don't get much sympathy from the public, but we should remember that politicians are human beings too, and things like having to do your job while looking after young kids, worrying about elderly around, all of those sorts of problems that everyone else has faced, actually politicians face, as well. And therefore there may well be some politicians who we will see really step up their game next year.
Yeah.
Just because, like everyone else, it then, as normality returns, it's easier to do your job well.
Yes, I think that is the case. But certainly you're right that, and this in some senses is a perennial problem for the Lib Dems, because they're not Her Majesty's official, loyal opposition. They just don't get turned to automatically in the way that that Labour do. So in visibility terms, it is a real struggle for the Liberal Democrats. And this is where, in some ways, those local elections could make a big difference. because as we know, the Lib Dems, traditionally are very good at those kind of local elections, and if they are able to kind of turn things around for themselves there, make some gains or whatever, that will get the media paying a little bit more attention to them and put them on the public's radar, perhaps more than they are at the moment.
And also, I think the local elections provide a good focus for Lib Dems to get out campaigning. So it's not just the results of the elections, it's also all the extra effort and local publicity seeking that flows in advance of them. But as we speak, it looks like, fingers crossed, there will be big sets of elections in May next year. But I wonder how long there will be between Tier 4 ending and those elections.
Yes, perhaps not very much time for campaigning at all, actually.
Yeah. So long live social media campaigning, clearly. So the fourth of your 5 factors was efficiency and professionalism. And I think probably for both Labour and the Lib Dems, that's been quite a big tick this year of, big steps forward from how things were before. And, some of that impact can be relatively indirect. But things like the amount that journalists used to complain about never being able to hear back from the Labour Party press office must have coloured to an extent their coverage of the Labour Party, even if things like the preferred editorial line of the newspaper owner might also have somewhat of a factor. But, things like that just basic level of competence is quite important, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth there. I mean, there were persistent complaints, weren't there, over the 5 years or the 4 years that Jeremy Corbyn was there, that journalists just could not get a response, and that seems to have completely disappeared now. He has a much more professional operation, Keir Starmer. There isn't anywhere near so much division between the leader of the opposition's office and the HQ of the party. He seems to have cleared out, as it were, or they themselves have cleared themselves out of many of the Corbynistas from Labour Party HQ. So he's appointed a new general secretary who's very much his choice. So from the point of view of the kind of the Labour machine, in all respects, really, we do have a much more efficient and much more professional operation. Well, I mean, when it comes to the Lib Dems, you'd have to say, I don't think that was ever such a problem.
Well, I'm not sure. Read the Thornhill report without telling any tales out of school. Read the Thornhill report. But I think we have made huge improvements on that this year. And, if you look at things like the senior team at HQ, there's been very significant changes, and also very significant changes across a whole range of sort of volunteer party posts as well. But I guess, for quite a lot of people, quite understandably, the jury is a little bit still out, because a lot of those changes take time to work their way through. And, things like hugely increasing the focus that we give to grassroots campaign support hasn't really shown results this year, because there weren't the May elections and people haven't been able to do campaigning and so on. So there's a bit of of the real test coming next year. But I think the changes that we've been making so far this year are pretty promising. And I think one of the things it reflects is that I think often the untold story about political party leaders is the extent to which they have a really professional operation behind them. And obviously that's partly down to them, because leaders can have a big impact on what sort of operation they have behind them. But whether you've got things like a really good press officer does make a huge difference to the amount of media coverage that a party leader gets. And I think one of the untold stories about Vince Cable's time as Lib Dem leader was, for example, just how there were almost no party staff around for the first part of his leadership, because so many people were on accrued holiday and so on. I remember somebody commenting to me that Lib Dem HQ seemed like the Mary Celeste for the first few months of his leadership. So although, you look at sort of political accounts of the last parliament and about, how sort of Vince Cable's leadership really blossomed towards the end of it, I think one of the factors that's often overlooked in that is simply that there was a degree of organisation there that simply wasn't there in the early days of his leadership. So hopefully all of that is...
we also know, obviously, from the recent history of the Lib Dems, I mean, going back a few years, that money can be a problem as well for opposition parties, and that can make a difference to capacity. I mean, it has, both for the Conservatives and for the Labour Party in recent years been a bit of a problem when they've been in opposition. And certainly, I mean, I'm not going to get you to go into the kind of ins and outs of Lib Dem finances, but over the years they've occasionally been quite problematic. The party had to move to Cowley Street, etc., and that can mean that you can't always get as many people as you want, or even get the people that you need.
Yeah, I'll be tempted to include a donate to the Lib Dems link in the show notes then after that, Tim. But on your final criteria, adaptability to circumstances, and we've touched on this a little bit already, obviously, in talking about coronavirus. The thing that I really wonder, though, and I'm puzzled why there isn't more commentary about this, in things like the likes of The Guardian, The New Statesman, etc., is it seems to me really unclear whether Keir Starmer has a step 2 in his plan. Step 1 in his plan. Well, I guess step 1 was win the leadership. Step 2 was then very obviously be not Jeremy Corbyn. And I think he's done that. It's not clear that he's got another step coming. And I guess in that sense, the question is a bit like the debates there were and still are, I guess, over John Smith's time as Labour Party leader. When John Smith became Labour leader after Neil Kinnock, his approach very much seemed to be, let's do everything as we did before, but with a different front man, and a different front man is enough to take what we did before into being a winning election proposition. So John Smith didn't do very much in terms of changing Labour policy or changing Labour organisation. It was, he's John Smith, he's not Neil Kinnock. And because of John Smith's tragic death from a heart attack before we got to fight a general election, we'll never know whether that was enough or not. Obviously, the Tony Blair diagnosis was that wasn't sufficient, which is why Tony Blair then made so many more changes to Labour before winning the 97 election. And with Keir Starmer, it feels like he's, I don't know, is he wanting to be a John Smith type character that we've pretty much seen, all that he's going to change this year? Or is there more coming?
Well, I mean, I think if he does have a step 2 or 3, whichever it is, I mean, it has to be, and in some ways this is taking a leaf out of John Smith's book, undermining the competence of the government, or undermining its competence rating. That's something that John Smith was very, very effective at doing. I mean, to some extent, he had an easy target because, of course,
I mean, well, with the ERM,
yes, absolutely.
When Britain crashed out of the ERM, but the Tory party poll ratings took quite a hammering very quickly, and certainly, I think John Smith handled himself very well, was very impressive in Parliament, but it was the issue that really hammered. It was the public very clearly blamed the government for what happened, in a way that the public hasn't blamed Boris Johnson for coronavirus. If you listen to things like the Times Redbox regular focus groups, or Deborah Mattinson when she talks about the focus group she's running, time and again, the story from swing voters is that they feel that Boris Johnson is sort of struggling, trying to do his best. And the more critical ones also think his best isn't nearly good enough. Not surprisingly, that's the view I would agree with. But there is a sense of, of sort of sympathy, or a little bit of reservoir of goodwill, which he's obviously been using up quite a lot through the year. But with the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism debacle in autumn 1992, there was no sense of, oh, the poor Chancellor Norman Lamont is really trying his best, was it? It was these people are massively to blame. They've now, had a huge damaging policy U-turn forced on them. So in that sense, is copying John Smith really enough? Because circumstances helped John Smith in a way that they haven't played out in a similar way for Keir Starmer.
I mean, I think you're right, obviously, to say that the ejection from the RM was very much seen as the government's fault, rather than necessarily kind of bolt from the blue, natural causes, as it were. But I mean, there is a difference there, isn't there, in the sense that, as you say, a lot of what Deborah Mattinson and other qualitative researchers are showing, and indeed the evidence of quantitative research, suggests that people are beginning to doubt this government, but they're not yet prepared necessarily to kind of move away from it and move to Labour. One of the things that John Smith was able to do was to get them to move, as it were, directly from the Conservatives to Labour. Not only did the Conservatives go down, I mean, you're the kind of historic polling guru here, Mark, but actually, Labour's rating went up quite considerably. And I think if Keir Starmer continues to kind of pound away at the government's competence ratings, that could happen. I mean, one of the things that Will Jennings and Jane Green show in their research, they've got a really good book on this, is that actually government's competence in particular areas can begin to kind of bleed over into a general impression of incompetence. And that, I think, could happen. I think particularly what went on just before Christmas, with people being given 5 days, then that's suddenly reduced, some chaos seen on the transport network. We have disruption, whatever happens over Brexit. We have lorries parked up, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think that might begin to tell. And particularly when Johnson himself is not seen as a particularly, efficient or competent politician. So I do actually think, you do make a good point there, that it's not enough simply to hammer the government, but actually that is pretty important. And 4 years out from a general election, or it might come quicker than that, I think Keir Starmer is quite concerned to keep his powder dry in terms of policy development, partly because nobody's going to be paying much attention anyway to policy in other areas. Although he did make a speech just before Christmas about devolution, and in some ways, focusing on destroying the government before, as it were, trying to kind of invade its territory isn't a bad strategy.
Yeah, I suspect if we do a repeat of this in a year's time, that's probably very much a question that we will come back to, as to whether whether it's turned out that there is something beyond simply knocking the government, or indeed whether it's looking like there needs to be anything beyond simply knocking the government, because obviously the old political cliche is that governments lose elections. It's not that oppositions win elections. But I do wonder, in particularly the multi-party system that we have, where if you don't like the Tories, there are quite a lot of other parties you can choose from, whether actually it's enough to simply be not to the Tories, whether you actually need to have something that is more positive. Now, it might be that actually that just becomes a matter of, sort of geographic tactics and organisation, that even if you don't have a particularly powerful pro-Labour message, just being not the Tories in the seats where you're closest to beating the Tories is enough, because you can win people over on a tactical message and so on. And obviously there'll be an extent to which that, I'm sure that, the Lib Dems, we will try something very similar of sort of coalescing anti-Tory voters behind the Lib Dem candidate in various seats. So I guess just finally, to sort of wrap up those 5 lessons, I think thinking about what we've just said about how both Labour and the Lib Dems are doing on each of the 5 of them, what would be your bit of advice to each of the parties in terms of what each of us needs to get right next year?
I mean, I think for Keir Starmer, clearly he's got to resolve the Jeremy Corbyn issue, and he's got to resolve that in his favour, however that goes. And that means either a kind of, apology, grovelling or otherwise from Jeremy Corbyn before he's let back into the PLP, or probably ideally actually keeping Jeremy Corbyn out of the PLP altogether. That's the first thing he has to do. Second thing is, carry on chipping away at the government's competence rating, as we've talked about, and hopefully broadening it out from its supposed incompetence over coronavirus to its more general competence. That's the other thing. And I guess to begin to bring some more of his colleagues into the limelight, and hopefully some more policies as well. But then, as I say, you don't want to make policies too early, because otherwise the government will simply steal them or or just spend their time rubbishing them. And for the Lib Dems, I mean, it is all about visibility, but that's very, very difficult, which is why I think, we have spoken about it, concentrating on doing as well as they possibly can at these local elections in order to give themselves, in media terms, the kind of legitimacy and credibility and visibility that that 11 MPs can't get you is very, very important. So, it won't disturb you to say that I think, as much emphasis as possible on campaigning, virtual or otherwise, in order to do well at those elections is going to be crucial.
Yeah. Especially as they are, in a way, not just local elections. We've got, in effect, a general election in Scotland and a general election in Wales, given the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate are also up for election. So it is a massive set of elections.
Absolutely.
With a lot of political power. There's a lot of political power at stake, and both, although I think it's often forgotten, the SNP, actually lost their majority at the last Scottish elections. The Lib Dems are in coalition government in Wales. That it's not just that in theory a lot of political power is at stake in both of those bodies, but it's also very credible that with good election results there will be real Lib Dem influence on what happens. So on that note of exhaustion to Lib Dem listeners to go out and campaign as soon as we safely can, one final question for you, Tim. What new books or research from you have we got to look forward to in 2021?
Well, there will be a co-authored book, which will be the Nuffield study of the general election. This is the one that comes out, a year or two after.
You are the new Phil Cowley, is that right?
Then? I wouldn't possibly describe myself as the new Phil Cowley. He is unique, and no one could replace him. But it's a team, actually. It's me, Rob Ford from Manchester University, Will Jennings from Southampton, and Paula Surridge from Bristol. We've completed, I think, all the interviews for that, and as you know, it's a mix of kind of qualitative research and quantitative research, really kind of going into the weeds of the election and trying to come up with a kind of overall narrative of the election, but also a kind of analytical narrative and an explanation of what went on and what explains that very big Tory majority. So that's coming together now. We're beginning to sort of really get into the chapters. Hopefully that will be out in the middle of next year. Certainly it will be out ready for conference, and hopefully it will be a real conference. It'll be on the conference bookstands by then. I've got a few other kind of comparative projects on the boil, but I'll be starting a kind of 2-year project looking at what on earth has happened to the Conservative Party over the last 5 years.
Fascinating. That will be fascinating. Especially, I think, given your expertise in looking at political party membership, just that question about what's really happened at the grassroots, because I do wonder whether the story with the Tories is a bit like the story with Labour, as in the popular account has been rather overdone. So the popular account of Labour was all about a Corbynite takeover of the party and how lots of changes were being made to lock in Corbynite influence, beyond Jeremy Corbyn, etc. And an awful lot of that collapsed, not quite like a house of cards, but yeah, the Corbynite influence of the Labour Party clearly massively tailed away the moment Corbyn left the Labour Party leadership. And so I do wonder, it'd be really fascinating to see what you find about how much the Tory grassroots has really changed versus how much what we've seen about the Tory party is really about whoever happens to have been leader at the time. So good, excellent, lots of stuff to look forward to there. I don't know, is the Nuffield book available for pre-order yet?
Oh, I don't think we've quite got that far. Yeah. I'm not sure we've even decided.
I will check. If it is, I will put a link in the show notes so that people can get their orders in early. Because I know that's one of the things that does seem to make quite a big difference for books these days, isn't it? It's pre-ordering ahead of publication.
Oh, well, we'll have to come back on the show. Perhaps all 4 of us can gang up on you.
Well, I think 3 out of the 4 of you have been guests on here, but Will Jennings, I don't think I've had on the show before.
Oh, you should definitely get Will. He's a fascinating character. He's an absolute mine of information, and he's also really, really interesting about what happens on election night. Talk about US politics, because he was doing the kind of Sky, behind the scenes stuff for the presidential election.
That's a really good idea. I did speak to Will recently, actually, as part of the research for my book that's hopefully out the year after next about opinion polling. But that's a good idea. I think I may see if he can come on the show to further plug your excellent new forthcoming book. But thank you very much for coming on the show again, Tim. Listeners can find Tim on Twitter at Prof Tim Bale, myself at Mark Pack, and this podcast at Bar Chart Podcast. Look out in the show notes for follow-up links to what we've discussed. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or a review in your favourite podcast app. Thank you until next time.